She had already chosen the dress she would be buried in. It was folded neatly at the bottom of the cedar chest in her room. A pale blue wool dress, the one she had worn to her sister's wedding years before. She told her daughter which hymns to sing. She told her husband where to find the deed to the house, and then she lay down and waited for the end. Her name was Beatrice. Not the Beatrice in your file, not a borrowed name from another story. This was Beatrice Fellows, born in a farmhouse outside of Brantford, Ontario in 1881, during a February so cold that the midwife's hands shook when she held her. Beatrice grew up thin and sharp-minded, the kind of girl who memorized scripture not because she was told to, but because the words felt like water in a dry place. She married a quiet farmer named Harold at 22. They had 3 children. And for a while, life was ordinary in the way that most lives are. Full of small mercies and small griefs, nothing that would ever make someone want to tell the story. Then the tuberculosis came. It came the way it always did in 1912. Slowly at first, like a rumor. A cough that lingered past winter. A tiredness that sleep wouldn't cure. By the time the doctor in Brantford had a name for what was happening inside her lungs, Beatrice had already lost 12 pounds and was bringing up blood into her handkerchief and hiding it from Harold so he wouldn't panic. The doctor, a practical man named Whitmore, who had seen this many times before, gave her perhaps 8 months. He said it gently. He was kind, but he said it. Harold didn't cry until he was outside on the porch, his back to the door, his hand pressed flat against the wood siding of the house. Beatrice went home and folded the blue dress. Now, before we go any further, you have to understand what Canada looked like for a woman of faith in 1912. The Pentecostal movement was barely a decade old. The Azusa Street revival had happened just 6 years earlier, and the news of it had traveled north, in fragments. Carried in letters, spoken in hushed voices at prayer meetings, dismissed as emotionalism by mainline churches and theologians who had spent their careers building careful, respectable theology. To pray for healing, to actually believe that God could heal a dying woman in a farmhouse in Ontario, was not merely naive. It was in many circles considered theologically dangerous. Beatrice knew all of this. She had grown up Presbyterian. She believed in order. She believed in propriety. She believed, on some very deep level, that the miracles in the Gospels were historical, real, true, documented, but also that they belonged to another age, a foundational age, and that God now spoke through providence and medicine and the passage of time. She believed this the way most people believe things they have never been forced to test. Then her 8 months began to run out. It was her youngest, a boy named Peter, 7 years old, who first brought the pamphlet home. He had found it tucked under the door of the church hall in town, left by someone who had passed through. A small, poorly printed sheet of paper describing healing meetings being held in a town called Markham, about 60 miles west. The man leading them was named Edwin Groves. The pamphlet described him as a lay preacher with no formal theological training and no denominational backing. It described healings. It described crippled men walking. It described tumors dissolving. It was precisely the sort of thing that Beatrice, 1 month earlier, would have set aside with a polite expression and a private thought about credulity. She read it 4 times. Harold found her in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, the pamphlet flattened on the table in front of her, her hands folded over it, as though it were something she needed to hold down. "I need to go," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man of many words. "To Markham," he said. "Yes." He sat down across from her. "Beatrice, I know what you're going to say." "Do you?" She looked up at him. "I'll drive you," he said. They left before dawn. Peter stayed with the neighbors. The 2 older children, Margaret and Thomas, were told their mother was going to see a specialist. This was not entirely a lie, though the specialist in question had no medical degree and held his meetings in a rented hall above a hardware store. Edwin Groves was not what Beatrice expected. She had imagined someone theatrical, someone with a commanding voice and a flair for showmanship, the kind of man who knew how to work a crowd. Groves was 53 years old, short, with reading glasses he kept pushing up his nose, and a way of speaking that was quiet almost to the point of being difficult to hear in a large room. He had been a school teacher for 20 years. Before whatever happened to him happened, he never spoke about it in those terms. Whatever happened. But the people around him spoke of a night in 1908 when Groves had knelt beside his dying brother and prayed for 5 hours, and the brother had stood up the next morning with color in his face and eaten a full breakfast. The brother, it was said, was still alive, still farming outside of Guelph. Beatrice sat in a wooden chair in the second row and listened. Groves preached from the book of James, chapter 5. He read it slowly, in the plain King James that everyone in that room already knew by heart. But he read it as though he were reading it for the first time and finding it surprising. "Is any sick among you? Let him call for the elders of the church, and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord." He paused after that sentence. He let it sit. "We have built very beautiful theology around why that doesn't apply anymore," he said, and there was no anger in it. Just a kind of tired clarity. "We have explained it very convincingly. And meanwhile," he paused again, "meanwhile, our people are dying." Beatrice felt something shift in her chest that was not the tuberculosis. He spoke for 90 minutes. He talked about what it costs to actually believe something. Not to believe it as a proposition. Not to hold it as a theological position, but to believe it the way you believe the floor will hold your weight when you step out of bed in the morning. That kind of believing, he said, required something. It required what he called the secret place. The hours before anyone else was awake, the prayers that no one heard, the fasting that you didn't announce, the long, unglamorous, unwitnessed pursuit of God in the dark. He said the healings people saw on a Sunday were always the product of something that happened on a Thursday at 4 in the morning that nobody saw. After the service, Groves prayed for people individually. Beatrice stood in the line for 40 minutes, and when she finally reached him, she found she couldn't say anything. He looked at her, not with dramatic intensity, but with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, and said, "You've come a long way." 60 miles, she said. "More than that," he said. He placed his hands on her shoulders, bowed his head, and prayed for her. There was nothing theatrical about it. He did not shout. He did not command illness to leave. He prayed in the same quiet voice he used for everything, and what he said, mostly, was "Thank you. Thank you that you are the same God. Thank you that nothing is beyond you. Thank you." Beatrice drove home with Harold in silence. The sun was going down over the fields. She felt nothing different. The cough was still there. The tiredness was still there. She told Harold she wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't this, not this feeling of nothing. "What feeling of nothing?" Harold asked. She thought about it. "Peace, maybe," she said finally. "But peace feels like nothing when you've been frightened for so long." She went home. She read the passage from James again, alone, at her kitchen table. She set her alarm for 4 o'clock in the morning. What happened over the next 3 months is documented. Not in the way of a medical journal, but in the way of letters, in the way of neighbors' accounts recorded decades later by their grandchildren, in the way of a community that watches one of its own and cannot explain what it sees. Beatrice began getting up before dawn every morning. Harold would wake at 5 and find the bed empty and know she was already in the small room off the kitchen, that she had cleared of everything except a chair and a Bible and a window that faced east. He never went in. He said later that he felt, simply, that he should not. She stopped losing weight in the 3rd week. By the 6th week, Dr. Whitmore, who had told her she had 8 months, sat across from her in his office and listened to her chest for a long time and said nothing. He listened again. He moved the stethoscope to a different position. He cleared his throat. "I'd like to schedule another appointment," he said. "In 2 weeks. Is something wrong?" Harold asked. Whitmore looked at them both over his glasses. "No," he said slowly. "Something appears to be right." She lived for another 41 years. She outlived Harold by 6. She buried 2 of her siblings. She held her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren, and was known in the last years of her life as someone who prayed with a peculiar authority, as though she were not asking for things but reminding someone of a promise already made. People came to her, not in the dramatic way they had come to Edwin Groves, not in lines, not in rented halls, but quietly, the way people go to someone they trust. A neighbor with a child who wasn't expected to see Christmas. A woman from the church whose husband had stopped recognizing her face. They came to the farmhouse and sat in the kitchen, and Beatrice made tea, and listened, and then she prayed, and she prayed the same way Groves had prayed over her. Without theater, without volume, with that same quiet confidence that could be mistaken for nothing if you weren't listening. She never became famous. That is important. There was no Zion City. There was no movement that bore her name. She did not write a book or found a ministry or appear on any stage. She was a farmer's wife in Ontario who got up every morning at 4 o'clock and prayed in a small room that faced east, and who did this for 41 years without missing a morning, and who was known in her community as someone around whom impossible things occasionally became possible. Edwin Groves continued his meetings until 1927, when his own health declined. He held them in 23 different towns across Ontario and Quebec. He kept no records of the healings he witnessed, which frustrated the people who came after him looking for documentation. He said once, in a letter to a friend, that keeping records felt like counting your children to make sure they're still there. You trust, he wrote, or you don't. He died in 1931 in the same town where his brother had stood up from his deathbed 23 years earlier. His brother was at his bedside. The funeral was small. There is a tension in this story that we should not smooth over, because the people who left the most honest comments about John Alexander Dowie's story were the ones who noticed that we had smoothed things over. So let us say plainly, not everyone who came to Groves was healed. There were people who sat in that rented hall above the hardware store and went home sick and died sick. There were families who prayed for 41 months and did not get 41 years. This is not something that can be explained away, and Groves never tried to explain it away, and that, perhaps, is part of why the people around him trusted him. He held the mystery without resolving it. He kept praying without a guarantee. And Beatrice, who had been given 8 months and who lived until 1953, she held the same mystery. She never claimed to understand why she was healed and others were not. In the last recorded conversation her daughter Margaret had with her, the week before she died, Margaret asked her directly, did she believe that God had healed her? Beatrice was quiet for a moment. The window beside her bed faced east, as it always had. I believe he was present, she said. Whether it was his healing or just his presence that changed something, I don't know. I'm not sure it matters. He was there. I found him in the dark. Everything else came from that. The blue dress, as it turned out, was never used for what she had intended. Margaret wore it to Beatrice's actual funeral, 41 years later, because it was the most beautiful thing her mother had ever owned, and she thought someone should get some good from it. It was a cool morning in October. The fields outside Brantford were the color of rust and gold, the way they always are at that time of year in Ontario, and the air had that particular clarity that comes after the first frost, clean and still and very bright. The minister read from James, chapter 5. There is something Edwin Groves said in the last year of his life that has stayed with the people who recorded his story. He was asked by a young man, a theology student, who had come to interview him, whether he believed that miracles were still happening today in 1930, or whether the age of miracles had passed. Groves took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. Tell me something, he said. Have you ever been in the room when someone found God in the dark? The student said he wasn't sure. Then you haven't seen enough rooms, Groves said. Go sit with more people in the dark. If you are sitting in the dark right now, if you are holding a diagnosis or a fear or a grief that feels too large to carry, then this story is not a promise of a particular outcome. We are not that kind of channel, but it is an invitation to consider. What would it cost you to pursue God with everything you have before you know how the story ends? Beatrice set her alarm for 4 o'clock on a Monday morning when she had no evidence that anything would change. That's where it started. Tell us in the comments. Whose story would you like us to cover next? And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. You never know who is sitting in the dark tonight, waiting for a reason to believe.